We're going to start yet again. So just kind of recap, make sure we're all on the same page for where we are with Nehemiah. So we kind of gave the history for Nehemiah, that he comes in what we call the post-exilic period. So everybody knows that Israel was overtaken by Babylon. Oh, you're done. Israel was overtaken by Babylon, and then that started the temple, and the wall of Jerusalem was destroyed, and that started the 70 years of exile, right? And after that during that 70 years of exile, you had the Persian Empire, which came and overtook the Babylonian Empire. And then is under the Persian Empire that the captives were slowly released back in waves, right? And that first wave went back and they got to Jerusalem, and they, under the guidance of Ezra, which is the book right before Nehemiah, they rebuilt the temple, but the wall still remained in shambles. And the wall was significant because the wall was really what made you a nation. If you didn't have a wall, you're kind of a joke of a nation. If you had a wall, that means you had protection, you had defenses, like you were a force to be reckoned with. One of the things that made Jerusalem like such a force to be reckoned with was it was a huge like a huge nation with a sizable wall and a temple. So they had all the pieces, you know, that really made them a complete nation. But the wall was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. The first wave of people to come back and build the temple, and now when Nehemiah was still in, serving the king in Persia, he heard that the wall was still in shambles, and that's when it's kind of struck him to the heart, and he started to pray. And while he prayed, he planned on how he would, if he had the chance, how would he rebuild the wall, right? And we kind of unpacked that over the last 2 weeks, but Nehemiah prayed and he planned as if God was going to answer his prayers and give him a chance because he was the cupbearer to the king. And God opened up a small door and Nehemiah took it because he was ready to take it, right? And he talked to the king and he said, okay, let me go back and rebuild the wall of my nation because it's right now in shambles and so on. And so the king, surprisingly, let him go, right? And this is the hand of God working with Nehemiah. Right? Nehemiah had this vision for the wall, and God is kind of giving him every step in the way. And then he not only gets permission to go, but he gets the king to finance the project by allowing him to go to the forest to get timber in order to rebuild the wall. And then he asked for the king, to give him letters so that when I go back, I can give the other governors in the surrounding area the letters that saying I have the permission to build the wall. So he got a lot out of the king. Nehemiah was clearly thinking. But then he goes back and he inspects the wall and sees the condition of it. And he, a big hurdle, one of the many still hurdles that he's got to overcome is how does he get everybody to work? Like you can have all the timber, but you need the hands, right? And that was the unknown for Nehemiah. How is he going to get people to work? So Nehemiah cast his vision to everybody about how to build the wall. And there are 4 parts to casting everything. What did Nehemiah have? Who remembers from last week? Sorry. That was a good team. There's 4 parts to how Nehemiah shared the vision to rebuild the wall that got everybody on board. He said, what was the problem? Okay. And the problem was the walls are busted up, right? So he stated the obvious, but we need sometimes the obvious to be stated because the Israelites were living in Jerusalem and going about their business and the walls were down and they didn't care, right? It's like when somebody comes over to your house, the example that you had is somebody comes over to your house and all of a sudden like points out like, oh man, your bathroom really needs to be clean. You're like, what do you mean my bathroom needs to be clean? Like, okay, like once they leave, what are you going to do? You're going to go clean the bathroom. Like they kind of alerted you to an issue, right? So they stated the problem. What else?
Give them a reason why this.
Before the reason. You're going to say the problem. Give up. Solution, right? So the solution was, let's rebuild the wall, right? So it was simple, right? But sometimes we need these simple things to be connected together, right? Because we all have obvious problems. And we may know the solution, but we don't engage in the solution, right? We talked about like, oh man, or tell somebody like, well, I know I need to lose weight. Okay. Like, how are you going to lose weight? Well, this is how you're going to do it, right? So like we know the problems, but sometimes we don't like, and we know the solutions, but we don't connect them together sometimes, right? So we say it's a problem. Solution is let's build the wall. But then he says, why, right? And the why is key because we need that motivation. And what was the motivation to rebuild the wall?
So
Sorry, I didn't mean to point at you like you had to answer. Just using my fingers. All right.
so outsiders don't invade or like they'll be protected from outside.
Yeah. But he used one like specific word. Then chapter.
Doesn't have a
Yeah. If you are a nation claiming to be a nation and you didn't have a wall, you are an embarrassment of the nation. Right? So he said, like, we're a reproach, we're an embarrassment among all the nations. Right? So we need to build the wall so we can stop being an embarrassment. But why should we do this now? Because they've been living without the wall for quite some time. But why do it now? And that's where Nehemiah goes back and says, you would not believe all the things that happened to get me to this point, to get us to this point, right? I was a cupbearer to the king. I had a plan. He gave me a small window. I took it. I could have died in the process of telling the king that I wanted to leave and go rebuild another nation, but he looked favorably upon me. Not only was he favorable upon me, but he gave me the wood to do it. He gave me the letters to do it, and he sent me here. Now is the time to do it, right? So he puts all that together. And now that, everybody in Israel is saying, like, okay, let's go. Right? Everybody's on board and everybody knows why we need to do it now. So that's where we are. And
I think maybe there is another reason, a spiritual one, because God commanded them not to marry from other nations and not to interact with them deeply. So it's kind of separation.
that emphasis was actually applied more in the time of Ezra, right? When Ezra came and rebuilt the temple, and that whole idea of marrying people outside of the children came up, and it was a big issue in the time of Ezra. Definitely, like with Nehemiah, God is gathering, his people back to himself after being scattered, which is something all the prophets who came before the exile happened were saying, even though you're going to get punished, God is going to bring you back, right? So that reason is also God is fulfilling his promise, which he told his people. But that's a good point about the wall. All right, let's start off with our questions. So our questions. So we're talking about vision and pursuing our vision, but what are sacrifices? Okay, we'll start off general, and then we'll get a little bit specific. What are sacrifices that one person, might have to make while pursuing a vision for their life? What is a sacrifice that one might have to take when pursuing a vision for their life?
Sometimes you have to sacrifice family.
Sometimes you have to sacrifice family, leaving family. That's hard.
Sacrificing your time.
Well, you're definitely going to sacrifice your time. Agreed.
Sometimes you sacrifice your job.
Your job. I mean, Nehemiah had a good job. He was a cupbearer to the king. Right? That is a prized position. What are things that we sacrifice when pursuing our dreams, our vision?
Kind of displacement of something with another something. So
Do you have an example?
we have like free time, leisure time. We can displace it with another thing that we are pursuing after.
Yeah. So, sorry, two things are happening at the same time. So they can hear. All right, so Melania was saying that, sometimes we'll sacrifice comfort and additional time that we have maybe for pleasure while pursuing a dream. And then, somebody said comfort.
Sometimes sacrifice what you believe. Because sometimes what you believe and what you want, sometimes you have to like kind of sacrifice that a little bit to get to where you. I'm like, sometimes we have to sacrifice, like as Christians,
Uh,
we have to sacrifice certain things to line up with God.
okay,
And some things we want to hold on to, we have to give it up. And
okay,
so that's a sacrifice all by itself.
sure. Yeah, we have to sacrifice certain things that we hold on to in order to maintain our belief,
Yes,
right? And to be in line with God.
yes.
Agreed. I think one of the things that we sacrifice too is we sacrifice money
And
in pursuing our dreams, right? Dreams and visions don't come cheap, right? What are risks that we take on when pursuing a vision?
Risk failing.
You risk failing. Oh,
That could come with embarrassment.
you risk embarrassment.
Losing popularity.
Yeah, you can definitely lose popularity and your place in society.
but what I've learned when I accepted Christ, when you start talking about him, people don't want to hear him, so they'll walk away from you. You ain't gotta walk away from them, they'll walk away from you.
Mhm. Sure. Hmm. I think there's always that risk of the unknown.
Yeah.
That's like
That's the big-
we go out, like anytime we start a vision, like there are naturally more questions than there are answers. And so there's a huge unknown. Like Nehemiah left, but the risk was he didn't know if he could get the people to work. That was a huge risk, right?
But you also gotta know the difference if God's sending you out. Because if God's not sending you out, it's not gonna work at all.
Hmm.
So that's one thing you gotta make sure, is you hearing from God.
And that's a key point. And that, in our first week, we emphasize that because Nehemiah prayed. Right? He didn't act right away. He felt moved that the wall was busted up, but he didn't leave right away. He prayed and he planned, and his planning matured over time. And that's when he knew, okay, this is really from God. And then God still had a hand in opening the door with the king, giving the king to do all these different things. So that was affirmation for him of, okay, God is behind us. All right, God is behind us. All right. How can you avoid sacrifice and risk in pursuing a vision? You can't.
You can't.
You can't.
Sacrifice.
There's no way. There's no way to avoid sacrifice and risk when pursuing a vision. It is part of it. Right? Have you ever heard of somebody who sort of parachutes? You either parachute
Or you don't.
or you don't.
How do you test?
Right? Because you don't want to be one hand on the plane and half the body out, right?
No.
Like you don't sort of scuba dive. You either go in or you don't. And there's risk. So there's no way to avoid the risk and the sacrifice that are associated with pursuing a vision. The only way to risk it is to not start. Or the only way to avoid it is to not start. But if we're going to pursue, personally, where God is leading us, risk and sacrifice are part of it. No getting away. All right. Let's jump. We're going to go into Nehemiah chapter 4. And so now construction is underway on the wall. And what we're really going to focus on today are just the risks and the challenges that naturally come when anybody pursues a vision. And when we want to look and see, okay, how does Nehemiah deal with all the challenges and the risks as he's pursuing this vision of rebuilding the wall? Because they're similar for us, right? What he faced, we're going to face as well. Okay, So somebody read 1 through 6. 1 through 6. Chapter 4, 1 through 6.
But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and every indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and said, What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, Whatever they build, if even a box goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O my God, for we are despised, turn their reproach on their own heads, and give them a plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from you. For they have revoked you to anger before the builders. So when we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half of its height, for the people had a mind to work.
Great, thank you. What's the first obstacle?
Having people believe in your vision.
No. Like, what's the first challenge that Nehemiah faced?
Well,
Yeah, he's mocked. He's criticized.
Without support, he didn't have support.
You know, he didn't have much support. Okay, but the first thing, like Sanballat and the other characters that were introduced here too, these are all the governors in the surrounding area, right? So they're looking and saying like, why is he here? Why is he rebuilding? And so what do? They begin to mock him. They make fun of him. They're criticizing, right? Criticism is one of the first things that come when we begin to pursue after our visions. Because whenever we pursue a vision, we naturally bring about change. We shift the dynamics in some way, right? You know, for example, like you want to like pursue like a vision, and that vision requires you to move away from home. Well, what happens? Like, well, mom and dad may not want me to go. So what do? Like, are you sure you want to do that? Maybe not good. Like, I don't think you should pursue this. This isn't a good career. Like they begin to like question and criticize and so on. Whenever we pursue change, there's always a shift, and that shift invites criticism, right? And criticism or any vision, especially in its infancy, is always going to have more gaps in questions than answers. So it's really easy to criticize, right? The how question that like people like to heap on visions is how they plant seeds of discouragement and doubt, right? Like, well, how are you going to do that? How, Nehemiah? How are you going to get people to work? Well, what if the people don't want to work, right? How are you going to overcome like the famine that is going on at this time? Like, if they kept on asking all these how questions, like a lot of times the vision can be thwarted from the beginning, right? And one of the things that you know Sanballat and the other people are doing are like, well, how are you going to remove all the rubbish? What about all the burned stones? Are you going to reuse them? How much time and effort is that going to take from you? So all this criticism like keeps up, and what it can do is that like it plants seeds of doubt, and that's part of the vision, right? That's part of pursuing. Like one of the things that like I constantly think of, like, how are we going to raise 140K by the end of the year? Right? We have things in place, but I don't know if it's going to happen. Right? If somebody keeps on asking me questions, how? Well, I don't know. Right? But we have a vision for the house. We have a vision for why we want to pursue after this house. Right?
So everybody don't see the vision that Jeremiah saw. And when you don't see the same vision, that's when all our criticism come in and the doubt come in. And then when they don't see it actually taking place, that's when more doubt. But the person that God gives the vision to gotta stay focused on that vision.
Mm.
Like you said, all the scorpions gonna stalk, but if God gives you a vision, you got to stick to that vision.
We got to stay. Nehemiah was a very focused individual, and we'll see how. Okay. So criticism to a vision in its infancy can be extremely deadly, right? How does Nehemiah respond? What does he do? And while you're looking at that, think to yourself, when you are personally criticized while pursuing after something, what is your reaction? Right? You don't have to voice your reaction, but I want you to think, what is your reaction, or what is a natural reaction to criticism? But now let's look, what was Nehemiah's response to criticism?
He prayed.
He prayed, right?
He
And
prayed.
what was his prayer? Prayer, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as a plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sins be blotted out from before you. For they have provoked you to anger before the builders. Okay? He turned to prayer. What's a natural response? Defensiveness. Right? You criticize me, oh yeah, well I'm gonna come back. Right? That's our natural response, is to either get even. Right? But that's that's a knee-jerk response. It takes a lot of focus, as we were saying, in order to say, okay, I hear the criticism, but let me turn to prayer. If you were to describe Nehemiah's prayer, how would you describe it?
It was a simple prayer.
It was vengeful. It was vengeful, right? So what did Nehemiah do? He took the natural anger or defensiveness that one would feel from criticism, and what did he do with it? He funneled it into prayer, right? Which is totally fine. And one of the things I think we, sometimes struggle with is we think our prayers need to be PG, right? We forget that we can be extremely real with God, because if we don't say it and we think it, He knows it, right? So it's not a problem for us to say in prayer what we're thinking and feeling, because God isn't going to be like, this is how you're feeling, let me go destroy them, because this is how He's not going to respond like that. He's going to hear our prayer, as aggressive or vengeful as it may be, but He will respond appropriately. So we don't need to worry about pushing God in a way that He's going to be vengeful. Nehemiah got everything out. And because he got everything out in prayer, what was he able to go and do? Ignore and go back to work, right? Because his prayer ends, and the next verse, so we built the wall. The entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work, right? When we take response to criticism in our own hands rather than prayer, it consumes a lot of energy. And we waste our time responding to criticism rather than doing the work that we need to do, right? But when we funnel it in prayer and allow all our emotions to come out in prayer, right, then we're able to go back to work. David, so many of the Psalms are either Psalms of depression, frustration, or vengeance, right? Yes, we have some that are happy, but a lot of his Psalms were very angry Psalms, right? But he took out his anger through prayer and through writing, in healthy ways, and he trusted God to do what was right? And he went back to work, right? So we pour out our prayer, and then we go back to work. Now let's see how Nehemiah and everybody goes back to work. Let's read 7 through 12, verses 7 through 12.
Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the wall of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Then Judah said, the strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversary said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So it was, when the Jews who dwelt near them came, that they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, they will be upon us.
All right. So Nehemiah displays a really critical skill in where he hears criticism and he doesn't respond, he responds in prayer. But one of the things that we can do, and sometimes it's good to do, is to totally block out criticism. All right. But Nehemiah doesn't necessarily close off all the channels of communication. He's still listening. He's not responding directly to them, but he's listening to what's happening. And the reason why he's listening is because the situation is tough. Okay, he knows that they're angry. He knows that they're criticizing, because if they build the wall, then these surrounding, provinces and towns can't come in and do whatever they want in Jerusalem, right? There's a barrier. So clearly they don't want this wall to happen. So Nehemiah is listening, not responding to the criticism, but he does respond to what is being said. And what's being said by the others, right? Sanballat and Tobiah and the Ashdodites and all this, is that we're going to come and attack. And so he needs to hear that, not to necessarily respond, but to readjust, right? We have to learn to readjust our strategies, right? So it's important that we listen so that we can adjust when it's appropriate. So what does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah responds by saying, okay, well, let me set up guards in case we are going to be attacked. We need to set up people who can watch, right? Well, what does that mean? That's a sacrifice. Those are people who are going to be working on the wall, but now he's got to put them on watch. All right? So listening has to happen externally, but also internally, right? So he's listening to what's happening externally, and he kind of adjusts. But he's also listening to what's happening internally. And what's happening internally is that when it says Judah is talking about all the inhabitants. It's not one person, right? He's talking about all the inhabitants that are responding to Nehemiah and saying the strength of the laborers is failing. And there's so much rubbish that we're not able to build them, right? So he's also got a pulse on what's happening. Nehemiah is not a slave driver for his vision, right? Because he realizes that at the end of all this, the vision is to return God's people to God. And if there are no people left at the end of this project failed, right? So he's got to listen to the people, right? So as Nehemiah is hearing about the attacks that are potential from the outside, but then also listening to the people on the inside, right? He's kind of getting it from two sides. And what happens when you're in the middle of a vision and you have the threats from the outside and the struggles from the inside? What do you start to do? Did I hear?
Depression.
What? Sorry?
Depression.
It's depressing. You're like, oh my gosh, why are we in the middle of this? Did I hear God right? All those 4 months, maybe it was my own head that was coming up with this, right? Right? So we can start to question the vision, but it really requires us to be focused and to also differentiate God's vision from our plan. Okay? So God's vision, God isn't confused about his vision. If he gives us a vision, if he, as he gave Nehemiah a vision, right? He's not confused. A lot of times God doesn't give us the how of visions. He gives us here's the vision, right? our plans are just our best guess. Like at the end of the day, we're thinking like, okay, this is, God's vision. This is my best stab at it of how we're going to go about doing it. Right? And because it's just my best guess on how to go about approaching this vision, it's going to be revised. The plan is going to be revised. Right? Just because the plan needs to be revised doesn't necessarily mean the vision is wrong. Right? I'll give you an example. I like this one. If you were to think of the founder and the CEO of Walmart and how big of a corporation it is, how big of a corporation it is, right? Give me words that would describe the founder and the CEO of a corporation like Walmart.
Visionary, I guess.
Visionary, okay. Vicious.
Self-motivated.
Self-motivated, okay.
Adaptable.
Adaptable. What about with regards to strategy? Like very strategic, right?
He had a vision.
He had a vision, like, very strategic, very kind of calculated in what he did and how he, right? Is that a fair kind of guess on what we would, think of somebody, who is as successful as Walmart is, would be? Let me give you a quote by his son. Okay. So Sam Walton was the founder of Walmart. Jim Walton was Sam's son. In an interview about his dad, he said, "We all snickered at some writers who viewed Dad as a grand strategist who intuitively developed complex plans and implemented them with precision. Dad thrived on change, and no decision was ever sacred." Right? So what's he saying is that his dad had a vision, but the plan always changed. Right? The vision drove him, but the strategy, maybe this week was this, and next week it was something else. He made this decision here, but then next week he reversed the decision, right? So the vision kept it going, but the plan kept on changing. And so it's good to look at ourselves and say, okay, maybe God has me going here, right, in this direction. But I got to keep on changing my plan in order to get there. But if I'm convicted of the vision, it's okay. I can change the plan over and over and over. And that's okay. Right? So the problem is that when we have a vision and we, do our due diligence of making a plan, but we adhere to the plan in such a rigid way, we lose or we run the risk of losing the vision. Right? But if we let the vision drive us, then we know that the plans can be revised, right? Something for us, as we're going through our fundraising campaign, okay, we have a plan, for how to fundraise. But if we're not getting there, okay, we got to change the plan, right? Not saying, oh, the house is wrong. No, the vision for the house is it's getting stronger and stronger. Maybe our plan for fundraising needs to be changed, right? How many times, as I reflect on kind of how we've done church since our inception in 2015, it constantly changes. We do things for a little bit, it doesn't work. We change it up, right? We just had our Sunday school meeting. I'm okay, we need to change the way we think about certain things in Sunday school. What's our vision? To serve our kids and bring them into a relationship with God. Okay, maybe the way that we're doing it isn't working. Does it mean the vision for Sunday school is wrong? No. It means our plans need to be revised, need to be changed. And there's nothing wrong with changing. We constantly need to revise what we do. And, and be okay with that. Because if we don't, we run the risk of losing our vision.
And as you were talking, sometimes when God gives us a vision, we start the vision, but God wants to send people to help get the vision done.
Mm-hmm.
He'll give us a vision, or anybody a vision to do something, and we put it in place, but then God will send people that know how to fulfill that vision to come to pass.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like to that point, like I've seen so many times here, like we desire to like start certain ministries, but we don't have the right people for it. God hasn't brought them into the church, but He brings somebody else, and they have a different set of gifts and talents. Okay, so we're going to say like, oh, I like your gifts and talents, but like I'm not looking for that right now. This is what God has said, and it takes part in the overall vision of how the church can grow. So I need to pay attention and be like, oh, this is who God is sending me now. Let's see where God is taking me. And know that this takes, it fits into God's bigger plan for what's happening in the community. So we need to be very dynamic in how we approach our plans and be willing to change them, right? I'm going to keep on reading for us. I'm going to read 13 through 15. It says, therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families, with their sword, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and rose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. Right? So Nehemiah constantly revising his plan. He now repositioned people, but he repositioned them according to families, and then he gave them a weapon. Right? And it was a bit of an ingenious, I never saw this before. It's an ingenious like strategy move by Nehemiah, because if you're under attack and your family's right there, your motivation to fight is a lot stronger. Versus if your family's in a safe house, like sure, you're going to fight for them, but there's an extra edge that you have if you know you're protecting your family, right? So he's very clever in what he does, right? But he's always adjusting. Even though it cost him like labor on the wall and focus on the wall, he was willing to, redo it because he knew if he didn't, they ran the risk, right, of being caught unguarded and unprotected, which would have ruined the whole project, right? So always adjust the plan. All right. We're gonna read 16. There's a long section that we're gonna read, right? 16 through 22. Somebody can read 16 through 22. Any questions so far on what's happening?
Oh.
All right, go ahead.
My servants worked at construction.
Sorry, can you people here?
So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored in the work, and half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing.
Right. So a lot of details here that we don't need to get into. Just capturing this idea that Nehemiah was ready to adjust the plan however needed in order to keep things going. Yes, there were costs involved, but one of the things is like he had the mind and he knew beforehand, okay, I might have to readjust. When we know we will have to readjust and revise, we're more amenable to actually doing it. But when we kind of have like cement our plans with no flexibility, we're less amenable to making changes along the way. So a lot of it has to do with our mindset, right? So as we move forward in any project, right, or any new endeavor, putting in our mind that I will likely have to readjust is good because it makes us more able to actually pulling the trigger on readjusting when needed, right? Okay. Chapter 4, external strengths, right? The attacks from outside. Chapter 5, the internal strengths, right? So now let's go and see what's happening inside, the rebuilding of the wall that poses a risk for, the rebuilding. Because, we have to be aware of both strengths, right? There's internal forces and there's external forces. In every vision that we're pursuing, we will see. So let's see how Nehemiah deals with the internal struggles. I'm going to read the first 6 verses of chapter 5. All right. And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, "We, our sons and our daughters are many. Therefore, let us get grain that we may eat and live." There were also some who said, "We have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses, that we might buy grain because of the famine." There were also those who said, "We have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters to have been bought into slavery. It is not our power to redeem them. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and our vineyards." And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. Right? So what's happening now, a little bit confusing, so let me try and explain, is that they're on the work, they've kind of neutralized, if you will, the external threats, right? But when you think of what the inhabitants of Jerusalem had to do in order to put so much effort on the wall, it was a lot. They were sacrificing a lot. They sacrificed going to work. Instead of going to work, they went to work on the wall, right? They needed the work not only for their money, but to buy food. And they also had to pay taxes because remember, Jerusalem still fell under the care of the Persian Empire. So they had to pay taxes back to Persia on their lands and their houses and so on. So they had responsibilities, but they were putting those responsibilities to the side in order to work on the wall together. And at a certain point, like the day-to-day stresses of a work like this caught up with it, right? And different people were caught in different ways, right? So, the first one that he says is that large families, right, where he says sons and daughters, right? We needed more grain. So I had to stop working on the wall in order to go do my other work, in order to get money, in order to buy, food for my family, right? And other people came and they said, let's put it down here, some of the wealthier people who had land, they had to mortgage their land, right? Because there was a famine and they had to get that money in order to buy more grain, right? So they were you get a sense that these are people who are just trying to make ends meet while this huge project is going. Other people had to borrow money from others in order to pay their taxes to the king. Then another group, they had to leverage their kids as slaves in order to pay off their debt. So this was a situation that they're all in, right? And what annoyed Nehemiah the most is that the people that were buying the land, all right, or the people who were buying the slaves were their own countrymen. So it was higher end Jews taking advantage of the working class. And this is what really annoyed me in life, right? Is that the Jews were doing it to themselves. And this is why this is an internal battle. So let's see how Nehemiah responds. Does that make sense? Of kind of what's happening internally. I'm going to read 7-11. And it says, after serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and the rulers and said to them, each of you is exacting usury from his brother. Usury is like you give like some money, but I'm going to charge you an extremely high interest rate. It's so ridiculous. It's criminal, right? That's what they were doing. I'll give you money, but it's really going to cost you. Okay. Each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called a great assembly against him. And I said to them, according to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren, who were sold to the nations. Now indeed, will you even sell your brethren? Or should they be sold to us? Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. Then I said, what you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations of our enemies? All right. So Nehemiah essentially gathers like all the nobles, all the well-off, who are the ones taking advantage of kind of the lower class and the middle class and those who are working, right? And he says, it just can't be like this. Now, Nehemiah, he's continuing to emerge as a leader, and he's got this big project. And while we took care of the external, what we're seeing internally is that not everybody is on the same page, right? We may have been on the same page at the beginning and everybody had a mind to work, but as the project progressed and the stresses came, right? What we see is that there's a divergence in everybody being aligned. There's a misalignment among the people. The elders and the nobles are like, this is a good opportunity for me to get richer. Those who are putting themselves to work, like, okay, this is hard. So he doesn't have everybody aligned. And the problem is that if you don't, like, visions die when there's, I put it here, those are my words. Visions die in an environment of division. The visions thrive in unity, right? Visions die in an environment of division, but they thrive in an environment of unity. And what he has here is disunity between the classes in Israel. And because of that, like, he can push the people to work. But at the end of the day, he's like, you can push me to work, but if I can't put food on the table, like, what's the point of working? I'm going to work to build the wall, but then I'm going to die and not enjoy it. So why work, right? So he's got to bring everybody together. And this is one of the hardest things for a leader, is to focus on the unity. Because, there's an adage that I really like that says, culture eats strategy for lunch, right? Culture eats strategy for lunch. Means you can have the best strategy, but if the environment that you're trying to implement your strategy on is toxic, right, it goes nowhere. If you've been at work, right, and it's been very tense, and you have like coworkers kind of at each other, you have a lot of backbiting and so on, and people are just trying to get even, this person's trying to get ahead, you would say that culture is toxic, right? Who cares if upper management comes in and says, we have a great idea on how to push our company to the next level? Great, you have a great strategy. The problem is you have nobody who wants to work on the strategy. Why? Because we're all like against each other. We're all fighting, right? Visions die in an environment of disunity, and they thrive in a place of unity. And right now, Nehemiah has disunity, and he has to regain unity in order for the project to happen. Right? So he's got a tall border.
Well, Pastor, vision can die also if the people rebel against what was actually being laid out for them.
Yeah.
If they rebel against the vision, then that's when it dies also.
Agreed. And they're at a breaking point.
Yeah.
Like, because they're like, okay, my kids are in slavery, like I can't put food on the table, my brethren are, taking advantage of me. That's a reason for them to say, forget the vision, right? So Nehemiah, the challenge is to bring everybody into alignment, right? When you have everybody in alignment, then a vision works. If you don't, no good. Right?
Sounds like the United States to me.
Sounds like the United States.
That's how it is in the church. If
What?
God gives a pastor a vision and he expresses that vision to the members and they rebel against that vision, and then God sends somebody else in to help out with that vision, and the people that were sitting there get mad because you had the same vision, but you didn't want to work.
Mhm.
And it happens in a lot of churches. Believe me, I know, being in the church for a long time, when the pastors say, this is our vision, we need so much. Well, what are we doing as members?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What are we putting into it?
Yeah. Churches, I mean, the same applies for churches. Like,
Yeah.
if we can't be on the same page, then we go nowhere.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
That's it.
What it is. All right. So let's see how Nehemiah gets everybody back into alignment. Can somebody read verses 10 through 13? 10 through 13, chapter 5.
I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore now to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses. Also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them. So they said, we will restore it and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Then I called the priests and required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. Then I shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did according to this promise.
Great. So Nehemiah, talks them straight up and says, this can't happen. And he asks them to restore. But Nehemiah asks them to restore after also making a sacrifice himself. Right? So Nehemiah is a leader through and through because he leads by example. He's sacrificing his own resources. What do you say? I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. So I'm giving them money, I'm giving them grain to help them get through this, right? Every leader, if you're going to get people around you, is going to have to sacrifice something, right? And when you come from a place of sacrifice, it gives you the ground to say, okay, now I also want you to sacrifice as well, right? And so from his sacrifice, he asks them to sacrifice, right? And then he kind of adds another part where he's like, okay, you said you're going to do it. Good. Let me get the priest. All right, priest, come here. Now say it again. Right? Say it in front of the priest. Right? He kind of he puts him on the spot. Right? And he says, okay, not only are you saying it to me, but you're saying it in front of the person who stands before God. So you got to hold your end of the bargain. Right? Because if you don't, we'll shake you out. Right? Get you out of here. Right? Finding alignment is key. Right? And enough cannot, we can't say enough about the importance of finding alignment, across the board. And I remember, as we are kind of still talking about Susanna's house as a board, we went back and forth. And even though we had put an offer on the house, and it was accepted, and we were getting the inspection reports and had to do more digging and stuff like that, there was a sense, even as a board of okay, we're not all on the same page, right? Some of us were on board, some of us we're still chewing it over. But you got a sense we weren't all there. And it was kind of I'll be honest, it was a difficult moment because we're kind of caught where, okay, we put an offer and the offer was accepted. We shared that we had put an offer, but now we're kind of divided. Right? And it took us a couple meetings to really talk about like, okay, well, where do you stand? Why are you concerned? Like maybe we need to sharpen the vision. Maybe we need to like reconsider this. Like, is this the right time? Like we had to go through this process, like on the board, in order to make sure that before we really, put our, all hands on deck, that we were of one, right? And like, I won't forget like the board meeting in which like, okay, it was kind of like our gut check time of like, either we're all in or we're pulling the plug on this. And it was really cool to kind of go through that process, to hear everybody out, to ask the questions, to bring on like, different people to talk to us about, the finances, talk to us about, the structure of the house, all these different concerns that we had. But to finally come out on the other side and have a unanimous, like, okay, yes, let's go for it. Especially like when we knew that raising 140K was a tough one. And like I was telling them, that's our goal, but we have no guarantee that we'll reach our goal. Right? And putting all that on the table, but still having all of us come together and say, all right, let's work together. Right? It was huge. I couldn't imagine being on this process, like, and feeling internally as a board, we were divided. Thank God we're not. I'm not saying like there's no anxieties, there's no like, concern. There is, but that's natural. Right? We can't escape that. What I say, like the only way to avoid risk and I forgot my own question, right? Risk and sacrifice is to never like jump in. But we jumped in, but we jumped in all together. Right? We're gonna see this through. But alignment is huge. Right?
And then with all that, you gotta have faith.
Absolutely.
That's the
We
most
got a lot of
important thing. You got producing, you gotta have faith that it can be done.
it can be done. It can be done. All right. It's 9 o'clock, so I'm gonna close out.
That was short.
14 through 19 is captures this idea or gives us more insight into Nehemiah as a leader, because Nehemiah was the governor of Jerusalem. He was appointed by the king of Persia. Governor, he had the right to gather kind of goods like breads and grains and taxes from the people for his own provisions. And in this last part, 14 through 19, Nehemiah says, like, I didn't collect it. Right? Even though I was entitled to collect it as governor and a right to collect it, I didn't collect it. Right? As of the condition of everything. Everybody was stretched. So who am I to go and take excess provisions for myself? Right? Every vision takes sacrifice. Nehemiah was sacrificing his finances, his grains, his rights for the sake of the vision. If we aren't able to sacrifice, it's going to be hard to see our visions.
Mhm.
All right. Close in prayer. 9:01. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. We thank you, Lord, for all your blessings this day, this opportunity to gather together, to dive into your servant Nehemiah. Lord, there's so much to learn from him, his faithfulness, his risk, his focus, his desire to bring alignment to all those he worked and served with. Lord, help us to learn these lessons in our lives, in this church, in our different services, in our families. Help us to be focused, to not respond to criticism defensively and angrily, but to pour out our emotion in prayer and trust that you will give us all the provisions that we need to continue to move forward. So we thank you, Lord, for this time together. Bless each person here and hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In Christ Jesus our Lord, that thine is kingdom, power, and glory forever. All right. We are not meeting next week, so take a break next week, and then we'll meet the week after. So it'll be the first week in December. no, it'll be the last Wednesday in November. And I know it said 4, but it's gonna be stretched out to 5, so we have 2 more sessions to finish out.